We're pleased to welcome in just a moment our next speaker, Dr. Ryan Reeves, who's been serving Gordon-Conwell as dean in our Jacksonville campus. Comes to us already as a recognized scholar, especially of the English Reformation. Very fine classroom teacher. One of his books, Political Obedience and Resistance in Tudor England, published by E.J. Brill. And Dr. Reeves also has coming out shortly, Story of Creeds and Confessions, Baker Academic. And that's expected out within the year, next several months?
Longer.
Okay, right. It is forthcoming, so watch for it, The Story of Creeds and Confessions. It'll be good reading. But let's welcome now Dr. Reeves as he speaks to us on the topic of, is Sola Fide the doctrine of the church by which it stands or falls? Dr. Reeves.
Thank you. Yes, the news on that book is it's actually now being co-authored with Don Fairbairn, our colleague out of Charlotte. So come for the patristics and stay for the Reformation would be the way to think about it. So in private settings or in the classroom, the late Dr. Steinmetz, David Steinmetz from Duke, used to joke that for modern Protestants, the light tends to go out at Augustine, and it only comes on again when Luther descends from the heavens with a beer and a Bible, singing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." It's his joke, not mine. I give full credit. There's not a few that, yeah, that's right. And what he's speaking to there, the humor of it, of course, is the withering effects of time, the misremembrances of times, the way things look like a mountain range in their own context, but later on it's just a single solitary mountain, one idea, one impression, perhaps. And in a world of social media, these perils are only greater. They've only increased. Things can be Twitterized. They can be shortened. They need only 144 characters. And therefore, simple slogans often do the work of more contextual analysis. So Calvinism becomes simply tulip, and tropes about the Crusades are trotted out, or mere anecdotes about what global Christianity is in the 21st century. You try to describe the globe in 144 characters. Simply doesn't happen. One of the big ones for Luther is this quote, that justification by faith is the doctrine by which the church stands and falls. The Reformation, in other words, is no different. And in this year, where books and articles, blogs, conferences like this raise awareness about this pivotal moment, the problem is really only compounded. But let's set aside the popular misconceptions. This phrase, that justification is the doctrine by which the church stands or falls, hence the emphasis I'm putting there, the doctrine, which makes it seem like the only doctrine that matters. That phrase has actually been repeated ad nauseum by scholars, said over and over again as a more or less good synopsis of what Luther's own message was, that justification is the heart of it. That certainly is true. But of course, the way it is said is often as important as the words themselves. What's being said is that this really is all the Reformation was about, a one-doctrine movement. Luther, therefore, becomes a one-doctrine man. Just to give you an example, Timothy George, in a popular article for the Christian History Institute, Carl Trueman in his study on John Owens, others like the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion, and even the Lutheran ecumenical theologian Karl Broughton, all have used this phrase at some point as a central talking point for the Reformation. This is not to say that all these sources, of course, are coming at it the same way or understand it the same way, but this phrase has become omnicompetent at some point. This is the Reformation in a way, if you think about it, at least in the popular or an even scholarly imagination today. At the risk of a little bit too much autobiography, I became aware of this problem when I was doing my doctoral work in Cambridge. The late John Webster came and delivered a paper on this topic. It has since appeared as a chapter in his book, God Without Measure. His verdict, of course, was entirely negative on this as a slogan. He says that justification cannot be the ground of all theological discourse because it is, quote, determined by the forensic idiom of a legal dispute about divine honor and human worship. And he says it also, quote, risks not only narrowing the scope of the divine economy, but also isolating justification from subjects like election, covenant, eschatology, and so on. He goes on to say that justification becomes all that matters. And to put it in other words, justification, when isolated like this, doesn't have the shoulders to hold everything up. At the end of it, it becomes actually a withering statement, a narrowing statement, rather than a simple slogan to define one of the core issues of the Reformation itself. So that's how I came about it, but of course, as an historian, I went back into it and I said, let's discover where this phrase comes from. When did Luther say it? Why did he say it? In what tone of voice, if we could determine that, did he say it? And against whom did he say it? Because all those things matter when it comes to analysis, particularly of slogans like this. So therefore, what I want to do for the rest of the time is look at that phrase. How do we understand the understanding of justification in Luther? And is it the doctrine by which the church stands or falls according to Luther? Those who champion radical grace and other types of neo-Lutheran theology today, of course, will say yes. Others will at least say, I'm not so sure if it is the only thing that is the foundation, this type of thing. First of all, the historical record. Of course, I went into the research looking for, throughout Luther's works for this phrase. After a relatively quick study, I discovered he never even said it. He says things like it, but like the other phrase that is often remembered by Luther, to love God and sin boldly, he never said either of those things. The phrase, love God and sin boldly, he wrote in a letter to Melanchthon, and the phrase actually is, if you were to translate it, sort of loosely translate it, is, if you want to have a big love for God, you need a big understanding of your sin. Therefore, love God, but be a bold sinner, meaning understand the need you have for God. It has nothing to do with sinning actively, boldly. It would be the worst statement if it were so to be that way. In this case, very similarly. And to borrow a phrase from Eamon Duffy, though this phrase, that justification is the doctrine by which the church stands and falls, is nevertheless, quote, famous, fatuous, but fatally quotable. So, all right, where does it come from? The earliest date of record that we have for this statement actually is not even from the Reformation itself. It's from the 1600s. It comes from a Lutheran theologian by the name of Balthasar Meissner, who attributed this statement. He says it's one of Luther's proverbs, though he does not give a source. The other major place this comes from is from a Reformed theologian, Johann Alstedt, who actually published a book by this title in 1618. In keeping with the standard of the day, neither of these men give a footnote, a citation, or anything to say where they found it, a practice that many of our students wish we would adopt as well. But that being said, there is no citation, there is no footnote, there is nothing to say where this came from. It's just simply asserted. And like many things, it therefore sticks. But it's not enough simply to say that Luther didn't say this exact phrase. A simple search in the library could have told us that. I wouldn't have had to fly up here and simply say, no, it doesn't occur in those ways. But what would be a better question is, can we find a phrase similar to this in Luther? Or if we cannot find that, can we find teaching that amounts to the way this phrase is remembered today? It's a much harder question. It takes a little more delicate care, that kind of a thing. Is the hermeneutic there in Luther? The answer there is actually mixed, meaning there are places where Luther seems to say this. There are places where he even says it more aggressively than this phrase appears. When he is attacking especially his Catholic opponents, where Luther's words tend to be far starker on the subject. I'll give you 3 quick examples. When he is writing his given the lectures that became his 1535 edition of the Galatians commentary, he says within the preface that in his own life, one doctrine reigns in my heart, namely the article of faith in Christ, in which, and through which all my theological reflections flow back and forth by day and night. If that doctrine is flourishing, then will flourish all good things, religion, true worship, and the glory of God. Not quite the same sentence, and certainly what he's describing there is his own life, his own gestalt of this experience. I'm hesitating to use the word, but I'll go ahead and use it, the existential side of Luther, the everyman that he ends up being. This is what he is on about here. But in the same commentary he says, quote, if the article of justification is lost, then the whole of Christian doctrine is lost at the same time. 2 years later, actually in a phrase that has largely gone unnoticed by historians and fans of Luther, thankfully, is that he says, quote, the article of justification is master and emperor, lord, ruler and judge over all kinds of doctrines, and it preserves and steers all the church's doctrines. So there's certainly plenty of that type of thing here, isn't there? Perhaps. The problem is of course, understanding where this is in Luther's life. As is always the case, is this the type of thing Luther might have said earlier in his life? Is this how he always was? Did he always think that the doctrine of justification was Lord and master over everything else? The answer is not really. That's about as academic as I'm going to give it to you, but not really. It's hard to weigh. But earlier on, he doesn't seem to be this way. In other words, for Luther, he actually spins the typical process for men and women the other way around, which is he's actually far more nuanced younger in life than he is later in life. As the time wears on, in particular as he comes to the end of his years, he starts to synthesize everything down to very, very aggressive statements that basically says, do not lose this when I am lost, when I am gone. Earlier in his life, though, there is not much of this. For example, if we trace Luther's theological development over that course of his life, we find, yes, harsh rhetoric, blustering anger, yes. Even occasional bullheadedness, yes. But we do not find this type of dehydrated hermeneutic at work, where there is only one thing that matters. So, for example, in the 95 Theses, not only is the doctrine of justification not the only thing he's talking about, it's not anything he's talking about in the 95 Theses explicitly. Rather, he's talking about indulgences, which certainly impinge on the question, but the word justification by faith never shows up in this very memorial time that we're talking about now. Again, it's not that he didn't have the doctrine, but if that is the doctrine that is the center, you would think he would put it as perhaps Thesis 1, or at least one of the 95 Theses, but he doesn't even have it there. By 1520, when Luther is actually far clearer on the subject, the primary sticking point was believed by Luther and the papacy to be the following. Yes, the material subject was justification. However, the issue they all admitted again and again and again in letters and treatises that they were really fighting about was papal authority. That the issue of justification was the one that spun the issue back to where Luther finally was saying, yes, actually, I think the church can err on this. The formal cause, in other words, was that. And actually, the very bill of excommunication that was released stated that that was why he was excommunicated, not for his views on justification. Of course, those are in play. As the Reformation then wears on, there's actually a lot of work that Luther does to describe what his theology is, and he does it, as Eckhart very capably described, in lots of different formats. However, when you go to his shorter and greater catechism, the ones he wrote in 1529, his very first catechisms, his very first confessions, he actually describes the entirety of the Christian life as it ought to be experienced and known by a layperson in, you might say, an idealized setting. In those confessions, not only is justification not the only thing that matters, It is not even the rubric around which everything is based. The Shorter Catechism, in fact, bases itself around three things: the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. It covers everything from how to raise your children, how to say your prayers at the table, how to confess, how to receive the admonition of the Lord, all these things. There is not this diluted one doctrine only approach. The following year, after publishing that, in fact, he even takes on a brand new issue, at least for the course of his Reformation, which is the subject of the Eucharist. And his break with Zwingli is over the issue of the Eucharist, and as far as we can tell, at their meeting at the Colloquy of Marburg, they spent all of 5 minutes discussing the doctrine of justification. Though, in fact, they actually have slightly different shadings on how they understand it. The doctrine of the Eucharist wasn't even just about the Eucharist either. It was about Christology, Trinity, and the communicatio idiomatum, and how those were to be understood in the patristic witness from Chalcedon and other places. So if all he cares about is one doctrine, why is he having this tussle with Zwingli and the budding Reformed movement about other matters? I could go on. But the biggest, what I find to be at least, the most important evidence of this actually comes from around the same time when he has released statements that sound at least like this. In 1537, the small Chaldaic articles are released. And if, by and large, again, these are not the articles that people really spend much time looking at, but that you might see the small Chaldaic articles as Luther's last confessional will and testament. He's played a role in the other confessions that were drawn up by the Lutheran faith. This one is the last one he writes by his own hand. There will, of course, be others in the Lutheran tradition, but this is the last one from him. It is, as Gordy says, this is part of that comic book scene that you see. It is the only confession that I have found written in the entirety of the Reformation where Luther just starts to drop into autobiography halfway through it. And he starts to describe himself and, quote, "I suppose," he says at the beginning, "I should reply to everything while I am still alive, but how can I stop all the mouths of the devil?" And then from there, he's off and away in his confession. It's not the more cerebral, staid tactic that others take. In that confession, again, he comes back to what is the ground of our faith. And like the smaller catechism, the greater catechism, he says actually the faith ought to be centered around three things: the Apostles' Creed, and now he adds the Nicene and Athanasian Creed as well. The very next section he describes the office and person and work of Christ. Of course, they're moving into questions of justification. What's important, though, is that in this text, in this confession, in 1537, he actually states that the central issue in his mind at that time, which who knows who's to say it wouldn't change a minute later, but still, his moment at that time, the central issue was original sin. And what he means by that is that original sin is actually the thing that they're fighting about when they say justification by faith. And he goes on, he says, so deep a corruption has set into the Catholic Church on this issue of original sin that reason cannot understand it. And in fact, if you go to the Canons of Trent, the decision against the Reformation, they actually launch in their right after their preamble into the question of original sin. They actually agree with Luther on this in the sense that they see that that is the main issue. Because the issue of original sin is, do you have the capacity on your own after the fall to do anything pleasing to God, or is it simply gift? And when original sin is placed at the beginning, then the trope of justification, of course, becomes a lot more nuanced, a lot more developed. You start to see that it's not simply a one doctrine concept. In fact, it's a lean-to, as they used to say. There's lots of things that flood into it. It is, in many ways, the matrix of many different doctrines that connect to it, which is why, I want to say here, why Luther can repeatedly come back again and again and say, justification is the doctrine. The problem with that, of course, is that in the Reformation, justicare meant three different things in Latin, the way that it was being used. To be justified, to use that word in Latin, was to simultaneously discuss justification, sanctification, and in many ways, regeneration. There was, in other words, rampant terminological confusion in terms of systematic theology when it came to how we understood all these issues. So when Luther says, don't get off of that, don't leave it, it actually is where all my thinking goes. He is not living in the 21st century after hundreds of years of rich theological systematic development as we've experienced it in our heritage. He is at terra firma. He is at the very beginning. And so therefore, what Luther ends up saying is that, yes, the doctrine of justification is all that there is, but rather what he's saying by that is that it became the wellspring, the rivulets that went into the bigger questions and the other questions that actually mattered. Not that it is the only doctrine that we should ever talk about ad nauseum, every sermon on it, every talk on it, every Sunday school, that type of thing, which you sometimes see in confessional or contemporary Protestantism. To go back to the question, did Luther believe in this slogan? I think the answer is, in a sense, yes. But in a sense, no, of course. Yes, he does believe that this forms that point of view that every Christian must eventually own in and of themselves. So one of the things that is pointed out, for example, by Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man in Wittenberg, when Melanchthon writes his commentary on Romans, he'll be there with you when you get there. When he wrote his commentary on Romans, he sat down and he said, you know what, Romans is not very good systematic theology. It begins actually merely with the need of the person. You are a sinner. But if you then go through all the chapters and take the systematic doctrines that are described and presented, they're technically out of order. But from the point of view of the sinner, the guilt-ridden person, it is how one enters into the labyrinth of the question of one's faith. So what Luther says is, yes, there is a systematic theology, and when he sits down to describe an objective understanding of how you might train someone in the context of ministry, he's going to give you a more nuanced, a more fully orbed understanding of that. But in the end, he says, we're all simply guilty people. And guilty people like to shroud themselves in a lot of talk. And the reality is that guilty people need to come back, he says, and come back again and again to the foundation of the faith. Now, not everyone has agreed with Luther on this, and one of the things that's not always appreciated is that the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 16th century actually weighed in on this. We only think of Catholics and Protestants, but in the 1560s, the Augsburg Confession was sent to Constantinople. The Patriarch there looked at it, and he goes, not sure if I like that. Not sure if it's my favorite description, but here's the thing. He agreed with Luther in principle on certain matters. On this question of justification, he actually takes Luther to task for his rhetoric. And I'll let him have the last word, though, of course, I'm not necessarily quoting him to be entirely right here. But his judgment, objectively, from as far away as Constantinople, is that when you describe justification as all that matters, you end up with simply the foundation and not the house. So, quote, one must not always deal on the basic elements. Not merely lay a foundation, but one must also complete the rest of the building, and even the roof, which is the perfecting of good deeds. If one forever dwells on the basic elements, on the foundation, as you call it, there will be nothing more for him to do. Neither will he complete the house, nor hold fast the foundation of wisdom, nor become wise. If then we love Christ as we ought to love him, we will grow in virtue and will punish ourselves when we sin, but not for the sake of judgment. We will not fear hell, but we will fear offending Christ. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reeves, for challenging some of our traditional hearings of this justification by faith alone. So while perhaps some others make their way to the microphones, let me pose this question. If I hear you correctly, in order to preach justification by faith alone today, are you suggesting that Luther would also say you've got to also link it or teach it, connect it to sanctification and regeneration and original sin and maybe other things? In other words, how to preach today?
Yeah, I think he would. I think he does say that. He says link it. Of course, the question is how are you linking it? Particularly the justification, sanctification piece. He, for example, in very quiet moments, things like the table talk when he's not lubricated, or other times when he's writing simply inter-Lutheran discussions, this type of thing, he is actually very often says, no, we don't deny all of these other things. But when the chips are down, when the fight is on, when there is at least a perceived or even a real attack on the center of his faith, this idea of justification, then it is clear the deck, it's only one thing that matters right now. We've got to get this right. So what happens is he has, I think, a concept of a very nuanced understanding of theology and these types of things, though not systematic in the more sort of recent sense. But it's always breathed through a rhetoric, a strength of his personality that always shapes it when it comes out.
Okay, we have a question here, but just another quick one here. You know, there's a debate among New Testament scholars, I believe, with respect to Paul, not necessarily Luther, as to whether justification is the center of Paul's theology or whether union with Christ is.
Sure.
Now, I don't know if same question would apply to Luther, but any thoughts on that? Is justification really the center of Luther?
I really do think for Luther it is, yes. Center. Not the exclusive only piece, which is really the critique of this phrase today. It's not, let's say even if Luther had said it, he would have perhaps meant it differently than it is intended today, which is that, it's all we talk about. But I really do think, it really does seem to be, when he comes back to what he says, the Christian enters the Christian life by knowing one thing: I need Christ. They don't know anything else. He says, at that point, though, the everything before and after component of the Christian life, all the other doctrines begin to be incorporated into the pedagogy of the church. And so it depends on what angle he's talking about, but for Luther, he's always saying, all I know is I need Jesus. All I know is my sin. All I see is the mirror of the law, and therefore it tells me I need Christ. But there are other things, but at that moment, I see nothing else in that way.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. Sir, we'll go.
Thank you, Dr. Reeves. I always like lectures that challenge my presumptions about things. One of the things that this is very helpful for me concerning is how it relates to Luther's statements in The Bondage of the Will, where in addressing Erasmus in the diatribe, he says, you alone have really come at the heart of what all the controversy is about. And he didn't seem to err. He was talking about justification. He was talking about the freedom of the will.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if in some of these matters of where the emphasis lies, it's not just the fact that he was a preacher of the gospel. And if you ever listen to Martin Lloyd-Jones, almost every text he touches upon, or theme he touches upon, this is the heart of the matter. This is the greatest thing. This is the thing you absolutely have to get, or you don't know anything at all.
That's right.
I mean, it's just how preachers get into the text and proclaim the text as if it is the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
Because that's how you ought to preach.
Yeah, and Luther always told my students, writes like a rabbit runs. So he's just going to go as he wants. And you're right, actually, I should have brought up The Bondage of the Will, because it's a perfect example of what we're talking about. There, the subjects of original sin become far more ingrained into his personality there. Meaning he's saying, this is the only thing. And then, of course, it feels like 3 years later, no, this is the only thing. I've not personally done marriage counseling. I've done counseling of people who have, though, been wounded. And if you ask them to describe the experiences in their lives, it usually is there is but one thing that matters. There is this wound, there is this season, whatever it might be. Of course, they know, and the person counseling them knows, that is not all there is. But for all you see, that is all that matters right now. Let's talk. And so you might say Luther, having come out of the monastery, just simply knew that feeling. And he was not going to particularly, this is why I think late in life it gets starker, stronger, more intense, is just because there are no more Protestants having come out of the monasteries, do not forget what that wound was. And so in that sense, he is saying it is the only thing, but he knows there's more to talk about and more to deal with around it. Yeah.